Thank you, Candace, Debbie, singers, Bob, the band, Carolyn. And good morning, friends, and happy Thanksgiving. I feel like I should be talking about Noah and the ark this morning, but that's not what I've been working on, so I'll go with the script. With this Thanksgiving season, I find myself very thankful for this opportunity to share some of my current understandings about our unity teachings. The largest part of our unity teachings we refer to as practical Christianity, or sometimes practical spirituality, and they have to do with achieving our desires in the world, whether those desires are for a healthy body, for a prosperous experience, or healthy interpersonal relationships. They all have in common that we set a goal for something that we want in our life. We affirm that goal is available to us from God as a divine idea, and then we confidently claim the fulfillment of that goal. That's a very important, practical set of techniques and tools that unity does very well. So, using those tools in the area of healing, we would construct an affirmation, such as the one you see here. I manifest health in the body by affirming that I am perfect, whole, and complete. Turning to the area of prosperity, we might affirm, I experience myself as in the flow of abundant substance and energy and draw to me that which I need. And in the area of relationships, we would affirm, I relate harmoniously to my fellow human beings and behold the Christ expressing in each of them. As important and useful as that aspect of the unity teachings is, I want to, as my friend Karen Epps would say, put a pin in that for now, to come back to it a little later in the talk. And I want to talk about a complementary and contrasting aspect of the unity teachings that goes to the core of why our founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, chose the name unity for this set of teachings. And that part of the teachings has to do with claiming an identity of ourselves with all that is, with the one indivisible spirit. The reason why it is important to complete the practical teachings with this unity or mystical side has to do with an experience in the world that we all have, and I think the Buddhist tradition has come up with a particularly useful way of referring to this, and they use a word from the Pali and the Sanskrit languages known as dukkha. Which you sometimes hear translated simply as suffering, but actually it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and it can also be translated as discomfort or impermanence or imperfection. And I think what we all find eventually is that as wonderful and as useful as these techniques of claiming and attaining personal goals are, that eventually we feel a little bit like that hamster on the treadmill, that we're just going around and around and chasing the same thing over and over again, and we have this feeling of dukkha that somehow that's not satisfactory. There's more to life than just achieving a personal desire. There's an image also from the Buddhist tradition that I think captures this very well. This one is from a Japanese scroll about 1800, and it's an image of a mythical being in Buddhism called the hungry ghost. These hungry ghosts are depicted as having insatiable appetites, but necks too thin to allow nutrients to pass down to feed their bloated and hungry stomachs. And so they are constantly trying to scratch this itch, so to speak, that can never be scratched, constantly trying to fulfill this need. A related image comes from Greek mythology, and that's the image of Sisyphus, who in the myth is condemned by Zeus to roll a boulder uphill every day. every night that boulder rolls back down the hill. So Sisyphus has to get up every morning, roll that boulder up the hill, only to have it roll down and start the process over and over again. And sometimes our lives get to be like that. We get to feeling the experience of dukkha very intently. And this is because we form this notion of having an individual self that is inside a boundary, and then outside that boundary there is the other, or the universe, or our experience, everything that is not ourself. And we find ourselves having to navigate and deal with that boundary. And we can think of our relationship between the self inside the boundary and the other outside the boundary in terms of metabolism, which is a very apt image here this Thanksgiving week. I don't know about you, but I metabolized some very fine food over the weekend, so metabolism's kind of on my mind. But in a very bodily, earthy level, we build the body of ourself by taking these nutrients from the outside world, ingesting them, and then from those nutrients we build structures. We build bones, skins, organs, systems. And we also use those nutrients as fuel for our activities in the world. The very activities we've been talking about in terms of setting goals and achieving them are filled with this fuel from the environment that gives us an energy to achieve those goals. This is a slightly more sophisticated version of that boundary between the self and the other, which recognizes the self as having three levels: the I, the me, and the mine, in terms of how closely connected we feel that these things are with our core. But we still relate to those things that we call mine, whether they're, my people or my possessions, in some sense as part of ourselves. And we could think of the I, the center of that circle, as who I am in my core self-identity, or as Gary Simmons likes to say, who I came here to be, what my purpose is. But surrounding that core identity, there is the behavior and the body of our activities in the world. What have I done? What have I accomplished? What have I shown up to be? What roles do I play? And we identify those things as the me. I am a father. I am a husband. I am a lawyer. Those are things that we do. They're roles that we take on, but they're one step further removed from our core identity, who we came here to be. And then at the next level out, there is the mine, which we could define as that which I dominate, possess, or control, that which is in my sphere of control or my sphere of influence. And so these are the things we have. And one technique is to move from the outer parts of those circles to the inner. In other words, at a certain level, we might identify with what I have. What do I possess? What kind of car do I drive? What kind of house do I drive? And then at a slightly more authentic level, we would identify with what I do, what I've done, what I've accomplished. But at the most authentic level, we identify with that core, who we came here to be, who we came here to express, not the body of what we've done, not of what we possess, but of who we are at our core. But there's still, outside those three domains of the I, me, and mine, this domain of the other, which is neither I, me, nor mine. And inevitably, we want to take that other and to change it, to transform it in a way that makes this process of metabolism easier. In effect, eliminates that experience of dukkha. Just make it like, just picking the low-hanging fruit off of the tree. But we find out that the environment is not so cooperative in that effort. And We feel like Sisyphus pushing that rock up the hill in trying to change our environment to make our achievement of our goals easier. So we also experience, in addition to dukkha, we experience this other, this environment outside those three circles as something that we are fearful of. There's an ancient scripture from the Hindu tradition, one of the Upanishads that goes back to 700 years before Christ, that says, where there is other, there is fear. So we have, because we draw that boundary of that other that is not I, me, or mine, we live in fear that that other is going to engulf or swallow up ourself, that we're somehow going to lose our identity in that other. And this gives us fear. And in response to fear, we engage in these things called defense mechanisms, which have been studied psychologically. And you'll see there one defense mechanism is called projection. And that's when I take an aspect of myself that is painful, as something I'm not ready to own or claim, and project it out onto someone or something out in the environment. So if there's a character trait that I have that I just don't want to own up to, then I will pick someone in my circle or my family and I will project that trait onto them, and then I can safely loathe it as outside the boundary while maintaining the illusion of my own self-perfection inside the boundary. Can we think of some things that we read in the newspaper that might embody this technique of projection? Contrasting defense mechanism is the mechanism of introjection, and that one works the opposite way. We take something from outside that self-boundary and we claim it as part of our own identity, even though it's not truly part of our identity. We put feathers on the dog, as sometimes we say. Put lipstick on the pig. All these phrases we use in the business world for these spiritual truths. Example of that might be if I pick a movie star or some other public figure and live my life vicariously with following that person instead of living my own authentic life. That's an example of introjection. But you see that we still have this boundary, which is drawn in red here, between the I, me, mine, and the self, and that boundary is giving us this experience of dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness. It's giving us fear, and we're making it worse by these defense mechanisms. We're distorting what's really there, and so the dukkha and the fear just gets worse and worse. So what's the antidote? What's the way out of this? Yes, there is a way out of this. And that is, since we can't change that environment so easily, since it's not, kind of in clue with our plans, maybe we can work instead on changing that sense of self-identity and to claim our own part in constructing that boundary. That boundary between the self and the other is not something that's simply given to us, that's something that we've constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed at different stages of our life to serve our current life positions. This position that the self-boundary has stages that we go through in development is an important part of psychological development as studied by clinical researchers in psychology. So this chart I put on the board is fairly busy, but I think the key things in it are that on the left-hand side you have a pole of assimilation or belongingness. On the right-hand side there's a pole of differentiation or independence. And then you have 9 or 10 stages along the way where the self constructs this boundary in different ways in a progression of stages in response to the life conditions that are showing up at the time. And I'll elaborate a little bit on what I mean here. Actually, if you take 9 stages, 3 of them have to do with ordinary child development, 3 of them have to do with ordinary adult development, and 3 of them have to do with what I call transpersonal development, which is where I'm going to get to in a minute. So let's start with the child development. What the psychological researchers tell us is that the infant enters the world with this feeling of an oceanic oneness with everything that is. It simply is in the world and doesn't recognize this boundary at all. So the initial boundary between the self and the other has to be constructed by the infant as a vehicle for its own growth. And it does this in a very simple manner. The infant in the crib will find out, if I bite my thumb, I feel pain. If I bite the blanket, I don't feel pain. And so I'm going to label that thumb as inside the circle of what I identify as myself. The blanket is outside that circle. And that creates the first self-sense that's developed as a child matures to maturity. Very primitive at that point, but useful in navigating the world. At the next stage of development, the child learns to distinguish his or her own emotional feelings from the emotional feelings of the universe at large. At the first stage of the self, the child knows the physical boundary, but it simply thinks, when I'm happy, the whole world is happy. When I'm unhappy, the whole world is unhappy. There is no emotional boundary. At a later stage of development, the child learns, I may be unhappy, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the world's unhappy. It's in here. It's me that's unhappy. And so that stage is an emotional identity with an impulsive sense toward gratification. When the child is unhappy, the child wants to be happy, and it judges the environment outside as good or bad depending on how effectively the mother or whoever else is outside that boundary administers to the impulsive needs of the infant. So when the mother brings the bottle or changes the diaper or whatever the need in the moment is, then that's a good mother. When the mother is not paying attention, that's a bad mother. So that's a simple evaluation of good or bad based on a certain level of emotional maturity. At the next level of child development, the child learns that it can mentally control the way the mother and the other objects in the environment react. And so the child learns, if I throw a tantrum, I might get a certain result. And so there's a reason why little children throw tantrums. That at that stage, that's an effective technique to manipulate the outer world to get the satisfaction of the desire. So they've moved from simply feeling that impulse and labeling good what feeds that impulse to being able to actively be an agent and go cause that thing to happen by their own activities in the world. So all that's very natural as a child develops. In pretty much all ancient cultures, there's a dividing line observed at puberty when the child enters the realm of the adult community, observed by various initiation and puberty rites in different cultures. And when that happens, the child is taught to take on the rules and the mores of the culture it's assimilated into, and to take a role in that culture, whether it's a warrior, a shaman, whatever the role is. And we now are into the area of the 3 primary senses of self that the adults in our society carry, with that first level being an identity, what's it called on this chart, a conformist, conforming to a cultural identity. And at this point, what is important to the self is whether I fit in, whether I'm accepted as part of the culture. So shaming is a very effective tool for a self at that level, because by being shamed, we feel like, well, I don't really fit in. I'm not really accepted. But at a more adjusted level of adult development, which is number 5 on that chart, called self-aware, the individual becomes aware that it's able to assume an identity more than just being a fungible member of that cultural community, that it has an individual self and an autonomy to act and do things. And while this is a step up in development, all of these stages have kind of healthy and unhealthy sides. And the unhealthy side of this self-aware stage is that people at this stage tend to be focused on winning and losing. You know, I'm either winning the game or I'm losing the game. Can we think of anybody in the press right now that might describe? And about being right as opposed to finding the truth. You know, so it's all about the individual ego and whether it's on top or whether it's not on top. But what we refer to as a healthy, adjusted adult in our culture is the next stage up, which is described as conscientious here. And at that stage, the individual is able to distinguish between an ideal self that it aspires to be and an actual self that it's behaving at, and is able to work on self-improvement in a number of dimensions toward overcoming shortcomings, working on flaws, embodying that ideal self. But the ideal self is still defined as that which is inside the boundary over against that which is outside the boundary. And so you're still dealing with this experience of dukkha, fear, projection, etc. So, what is the next step up? Is the fully mature, self-actualized, healthy adult in our society the final stage of self-development on this model? No, both the spiritual traditions, pretty much all of them, and modern psychology would say that there is an inflection point at that level after we've achieved healthy adult functioning in society. And the point of this next chart is that the center line represents where we've gotten to so far in our narrative, to where a person is healthily functioning as an adult with a very authentic, mature, functioning, self-improving ego. And you'll see that the line of the arc to the center goes in an upward direction, which is increasing differentiation towards a separate adult self with clearly defined boundaries. So in other words, healthy growth up to that point is defined as building a stronger and healthier ego. But you'll also see at that point the curve inflects down, and that the continued growth is about increasing deconstruction of constructed boundaries toward a conscious union. And so the inflection point there is the move toward decreasing that boundary and accepting the wider identity with that which we have labeled as the other. And so it really involves a shift to recognizing that outer circle, what we've called the other, as simply those parts of that one universal self that's entailed in the word unity that we have not grown into consciousness of yet. And so we see the other now as not something that's opposed to us trying to swallow us up, but something that we can befriend and accept and claim as part of ourselves and embrace and grow into. But how do we do this? It sounds kind of, okay, that sounds good, but how do you make that inflection point in the circle? Well, some of us may have been gifted with these spontaneous experiences of a transpersonal sense of self. I've had a few of them, and they're extraordinary and definitely change your orientation to things. But not all of us are gifted with those kind of experiences. And fortunately, there are techniques that can be used to actually cultivate this, and it's no surprise to this audience. The technique to cultivate the emergence of a transpersonal self is primarily the technique of meditation. The reason this is so is that in meditation, we dissolve not only our sensory inputs that come to us from the outside world, but we actually dissolve this very self-boundary as we've constructed it back into this sense of oneness, pure possibility, nothingness, and that creates space for the construction of the wider self-boundary to be constructed. So in other words, we deconstruct a boundary that served us to a certain point, but we inevitably try to cling to it after it served its purpose to provide space to build the larger boundary. I'm reminded of another Buddhist story there. There were two monks that were using a raft to cross a river. And they got to the other side of the river, and one monk picked up the raft and started carrying it forward, and the second one said, well, why are you carrying that raft? Said, it served its purpose. You need to leave it behind. We don't necessarily want to carry that raft over the next 20 miles of desert that we've got to walk across. But we treat our self-identities like that raft, and we try to cling to them after they've served their purpose. Meditation gives us a way to perhaps let go of those identities to develop the wider identity. So far I've used mostly illustrations from Eastern religious traditions and psychology to illustrate these points. So is this concept of the transpersonal self I'm talking about, is it Christian? Is it unity? Well, as to Christianity, let's go way back to the Gospel of John. And I think we can find several passages that illustrate exactly the points I've been talking about. Let's first look at John 9, verse 58, where Jesus is quoted as saying, "Before Abraham was, I am." It's clear there that Jesus is referring to something other than his individual separate self as against that other outside the boundary. He's referring to this transpersonal self that existed 1,000 or 2,000 years earlier before Abraham, the earliest patriarch in his tradition, walked the earth. So he's claiming his identity with this transpersonal oneself. In another passage, John 14:10, Jesus is quoted as saying, "The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works." There again, he's saying it's not my personal self-achievement that this is about. It's about the one Father and how that Father indwells me to produce a result. And so it's about my transpersonal self. It's not about my separate self. In John 16:33, I think we can say that Jesus even points to this concept of dukkha we've been talking about, even though, of course, he uses another word that we translate into English as tribulation. Jesus says, "In the world you have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." So he is saying, yes, this experience of dukkha is an authentic, real experience of living in the world, but by claiming this transpersonal identity, we have a way to overcome the inevitability of that experience. Turning to Charles Fillmore, our co-founder of Unity, in the Revealing Word, Charles says, "Adam, the natural man, is the incomplete self. The fulfillment of self is accomplished as man puts on Christ." And so you can see that Charles is using, as did Jesus, this term Christ to mean this sense of transpersonal self we've been talking about. I know the word Christ is used variously in different traditions, but in Unity it's very clearly used in the sense of a transpersonal self that we can all claim as our true nature. And Charles is contrasting it here between the personal self, which is Adam, and the transpersonal self, which is Christ, and talking about the transformation of shifting our identity from one to the other. So let me go back to that part of the Unity teachings I put a pin in earlier, the practical side, how we accomplish and set goals. My suggestion is not to set that aside or leave that behind, because that's an important part of what we do 24/7 out in the world. But I think there's a way to balance that practical pursuit with this transpersonal insight and perhaps overcome that inevitable experience of this dukkha, this fear, the distortion of our perceptions. And I think the Hebrew tradition gave us a suggestion for how to do this in the concept of the Sabbath. The idea that out of a week of 7 days, that we can take 6 days to pursue those personal goals, achieve our health, achieve our prosperity, work on our relationships, and take the 7th day to reflect on who am I, what is my sense of self, who did I come here to be. I'm not suggesting that we literally observe a Sabbath from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, but perhaps the recipe would be 6 parts engagement in practical pursuit in the world, and 1 part rest, reflection, and renewal. And so if we look at these contrasting poles in terms of balancing them, perhaps in this 6-to-1 formula, then those of us who are familiar with evolutionary theory and the dialectic would recognize that in a balance of polarities, there's the opportunity for transcendence to a higher level. And I would submit that that higher level of balancing these 2 poles of our unity teaching results in our ability to live our life in a way that expresses the divine ideas of truth, beauty, and goodness. In other words, we're still going about those same daily activities, but we now are doing them not just to satisfy that impulsive desire that we have, that our self wants from outside the boundary, but we're doing it to expand that boundary and to claim our identity and to project these qualities into the world. I'm reminded of a story that Dr. Curtis used to tell in this room about the building of this sanctuary. You know, he talked about 3 workers who were construction workers on the sanctuary, and they were asked what they were doing, and the first one said, well, I'm making $4.50 an hour. You know, that's one level of consciousness. The second one said, well, I'm working on framing because I'm with the framing crew and that's my job. And the third one said, I'm building a cathedral. So they all were going about the same practical steps and the same practical pursuits, but they had different levels of consciousness about what they were accomplishing. And so I would suggest that perhaps we could cultivate a consciousness that we could compare in our dealings with the environment to that concept of earthly metabolism that we talked about earlier, where we're taking nutrients from outside the body, building a physical body. And if we think of these divine ideas or transcendental values of truth, goodness, and beauty as nutrient values that we find outside in the world, and if we think of holding an idea in consciousness as ingesting that value, then we can use those values to literally build the body of our work that we do in the world. That's the me part of the I, me, mine. And to transform the environment in a way where we're able to recognize our oneness by seeing the truth, goodness, and beauty. So again, we've taken the same activities, but we now are looking at them from a standpoint of spiritual metabolism rather than physical metabolism. And it was interesting that as I thought about this, it came to me that in this same Gospel of John, Jesus illustrates exactly this contrast between physical metabolism and spiritual metabolism. There's a passage in John chapter 4, starting at verse 31, that reads, "Meanwhile the disciples besought him, saying, 'Rabbi, eat.' But he said to them, 'I have food to eat of which you do not know.' So the disciples said to one another, 'Has anyone brought him food?' Jesus said to them, 'My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work.'" So you see that the disciples and Jesus here are operating on 2 different levels of consciousness. The disciples are focused on worldly food, and so when Jesus talks about food, they're thinking about the first kind of metabolism. How is he feeding his body? How is he stuffing his face? Jesus is on the wavelength of metabolizing values, which he phrases as to do the will of my Father who sent me, that is to bring goodness, truth, and beauty into the world. So again, if we harmonize these 2 poles of our spiritual teachings, then we're able to work on transforming our practical activity in the world to bringing expressions of truth, goodness, and beauty into manifestation. So what I would invite each of you to do as you go about your practical worldly pursuits over the next week, which you undoubtedly will, we all will, is to work on cultivating a sense of mindfulness about the ways in which you metabolize these values of goodness, truth, and beauty. And to ask, what is the self that is constructed behind the boundary of self-identity? And to ask whether you are willing to relax your hold on the boundary to allow a wider, more inclusive sense of self to emerge. By augmenting our practical pursuit of worldly desires with an inquiry into our true self-identity, we open ourselves to the possibilities of transcending the experience of dukkha, dispelling the sense of fear, eliminating the distortions of our projections and introjections, becoming effective agents for positive change in the world, and recognizing our always already present identity with that one true self which transcends all boundaries. Thank you, and namaste.